You only want to play right from the start. You didn't mean to say all of the sweet things you told me. I was a fool in your dreams. Do you remember the story about the bus and the plane? Let go my heart. I've learned the score from you. It's time to part. Goodbye, we're through. But if someday you will see my way, until that day, let go my Let go my heart. I've learned the score from you. It's time to part. Goodbye, we're through. But maybe someday you will see things through my way. Until that day, let go my heart.
Hello, Brubs. We're back with Donna Tartt's The Little Friend, Chapter 4. I don't know which part of Chapter 4 it is, but we're here in the midst of Chapter 4. I'm about to start reading it once I set up a little chat room so people can say, is this the Bible? And for now it is. It's the Bible. Is this the Bible? I don't know where that little saying came from. I assume from the dumbest place on earth in TikTok, but I could be wrong. Wherever it's from, it's loathsome, but such is life. As the car sped off, Eugene rolled the tinfoil back over the window with trembling fingers. He was coming down with a migraine headache. Tears streamed from his eye as he stepped from the window. In the darkness and confusion, he bumped into a crate of soda bottles, and the racket slashed in a brilliant zigzag of pain down the left side of his face. Migraine headaches ran in the Ratliff family. It was said of Eugene's grandfather, Papa Ratliff, long deceased, that when suffering from what he called a sick headache, he had beaten out a cow's eye with a 2x4. And Eugene's father, similarly afflicted, had slapped Danny so hard on some long ago Christmas Eve that he flew headfirst against the freezer and cracked a permanent tooth. This headache had descended with less warning than most. The snakes were enough. Hello, bravs. The snakes were enough to make anybody sick, not to mention the anxiety of Roy Dial rolling up unannounced. But neither cops nor Dial was likely to come snooping in a flashy old gunboat like the car that had stopped out front. He went into the other room, where it was cooler, and sat down at the card table with his head in his hands. He could still taste the ham sandwich he had for lunch. He had enjoyed it very little, and the bitter aspirin overtaste in his mouth rendered the memory even more unpleasant. The headaches made him sensitive to noise. When he'd heard the engine idling in front, he'd gone immediately to the window, fully expecting to see the Clay County Sheriff, or at the very least, a cop car. But the incongruity of the convertible fretted at him now against his better judgment. He dragged the telephone over to him and dialed Farish's number. For as much as he hated to call Farish, he was out of his depth in a matter like this. It was a light-colored car, Between the glare and his aching head, he hadn't been able to make out the exact model. Maybe a Lincoln, maybe a Cadillac, maybe even a big Chrysler, and all he'd been able to see of its occupants was their race, white, though one of them had pointed up to the window clearly enough. What business had an old-fashioned parade car like that stopping right in front of the mission? Farish had met a lot of gaudy characters in prison, characters worse to tangle with in many instances than the cops. As Eugene, eyes shut, held the receiver so it wouldn't touch his face, and tried to explain what had just happened, Farish ate noisily and steadily, something that sounded like a bowl of cornflakes. Crunch, slop, for a long time after he had finished speaking, there was no noise on the other end, except Farish's chews and gulps. Presently, Eugene, clutching his left eye in the darkness, said, "Farsh? Well, you're right about one thing. No cop or repo man isn't going to drive a car stands out like that," said Farish. "Maybe syndicate from down on the Gulf Coast. Brother Dolphus used to do a little business down that way." The bowl clicked against the receiver as Farish, from the sound of it, tipped his bowl up and drank down the leftover milk. Patiently, Eugene waited for him to resume the sentence, but Farish only smacked his lips and sighed. Distant clatter of spoon on china. "What would a Gulf Coast syndicate want with me?" he finally asked. "Hell if I know. Something you ain't being straight about?" "Straight as the gate, brother," Eugene replied stiffly. "I'm just running this mission and loving my Christian walk." "Well, assuming that's correct, could be little Reese they come after. Who knows what kind of hot water he's got himself into? Be straight with me, Farsh. You done got me into something, and I know, he said, over Farish's objections, "that it's got to do with these narcotics. That's why that boy is here from Kentucky. Don't ask me how I know it, I just do. I wish you'd just go on and tell me why you invited him down here to stay." Farish laughed. "I didn't invite him. Dolphus told me he was driving over to that homecoming in East Tennessee. I know, but he'd never been down this way before. I thought you and the boy might like to hook up since you're just getting started. And the boy's got a big congregation of his own, and swear to God, that's all I know about it." Long silence on the line. Something in the way that Farish was breathing made Eugene feel the smirk on Farish's face as plainly as if he saw it. "But you're right about one thing," said Farish tolerantly. "No telling what that Loyal is into. And I'll apologize to you for that. Old Dolphus show had his hand in every fire you care to mention. Loyal's not the one behind this. This is something you and Danny and Dolphus have cooked up yourselves." "You sound awful," said Farish. "See, you got one of them headaches. I feel pretty low. Listen, if I was you, I'd go lay down. Are you and him preaching tonight?" "Why?" said Eugene suspiciously. After the close shave with Dial, it had been only luck that they'd moved the snakes down to the truck before he turned up. Loyal had apologized for all the trouble he'd caused. "I kindly didn't understand the situation, you living here in town, and volunteered to drive the snakes to an undisclosed location." "We'll come to hear you," Ferris said expansively. "Me and Danny." Eugene passed a hand over his eyes. "I don't want you to. When is Loyal driving back home?" "Tomorrow. Look, I know you're up to something, Farsh. I don't want you to get this boy into trouble." "What are you so worried about him for?" "I don't know," said Eugene, and he didn't. "Well, then, we'll see you tonight," Ferris said, and he hung up before Eugene could say a word. "What goes on up there, sweetie? I have no idea," Pemberton was saying. "But I can tell you who rents the place. Danny and Curtis Ratliff. Big brother. He's a preacher." At this, Healy turned to stare at Harriet with amazement. "He's a real nut," said Pem. "Something wrong with his face. He stands out on the highway yelling and shaking his Bible at cars." "Is that the guy who walked up and knocked on the window when Daddy was stopped at the intersection?" said Healy. "The one with the weird face?" "Maybe he's not crazy. Maybe it's just an act," Pem said. "Most of these hillbilly preachers that yell and pass out and jump up on the chairs and run up and down the aisles, they're just showing off. It's all a big fake, that holy roller stuff." Harriet, you know what?" Healy said, unbearably excited, twisting around in his seat. "I know who this guy is. He preaches on the square every Saturday. He's got a little black box with a microphone leading to it, and," he turned back to his brother, "do you think he handles snakes? Harriet, tell him what you saw over there." Harriet pinched him. Snakes? If he handles snakes," said Pemberton, "he's a bigger nut than I thought. Maybe they're tame, Healy said. Idiot, you can't tame a snake. It had been a mistake telling Farish about the car. Eugene was sorry he'd ever said anything about it. Farish had called back half an hour later, just as Eugene had managed to doze off, and then again 10 minutes after that. Have you seen any suspicious characters in uniform in the street outside your house? Like jogging suits or janitor outfits? No. Anybody been tailing you? Look here, Farish. I'm trying to get some rest. This is how you tell if you've got a tail on you. Run a red light or drive down the wrong way, down a one-way street, and see if the person follows. Or, tell you what, maybe I should just come on down there myself and take a look around. It was only with the greatest difficulty that Eugene was able to dissuade Farish from coming down to the mission for what he called an inspection. He settled down for a nap in the beanbag chair. Finally, just as he'd managed to slip into into a dazed and fitful sleep, he became aware that Loyal was standing over him. Loyal, he said, floundering. I've got some bad news, said Loyal. There was a key broke off in the lock. I couldn't get in. Eugene sat quietly, trying to make some sense of this. He was still half asleep. In his dream, there'd been lost keys, car keys. He'd been stranded at an ugly bar with a loud jukebox somewhere out on a dirt road at night with no way to get home. Loyal said, I've been told I could leave them snakes over at a hunting cabin in Webster County, but there was a key broke off in the lock and I couldn't get in. Ah, Eugene shook his head to clear it and looked around the room. So that means the snakes are downstairs in my truck. There was a long silence. Loyal, I'll tell you the truth. I've had a migraine headache. I'll bring him in. You don't have to help. I can get him up here by myself. Eugene rubbed his temples. Listen, I'm in a tight spot. It's cruel to leave him out there roasting in this heat. Right, said Eugene listlessly, but he wasn't worried about the snakes' welfare. He was worried about leaving them out in the open to be discovered by Mr. Dial, the mysterious snooper in the convertible who knew. And suddenly it came to him that there had been a snake, too, in his dream, a dangerous snake crawling loose among people somewhere. Okay, said the Loyal with a sigh, bring him in. I promise they'll be out of here by tomorrow morning. This hasn't worked out very well for you, I know, said Loyal. His intense blue gaze was frankly sympathetic. Having me here, it ain't your fault. Loyal ran a hand through his hair. I want you to know I've enjoyed your fellowship. If the Lord don't call you to handle, well, he has his reasons. Sometimes he don't call me to handle either. I understand. Eugene felt he should say something more, but he couldn't marshal the right thoughts. And he was too ashamed to say what he felt, that his spirit was dry and empty, that he wasn't naturally good in his mind and heart, that he was of a tainted blood and a tainted lineage, that God looked down on him and despised his gifts as he had despised the gifts of Cain. Someday I'll get called, he said, with a brightness he did not feel. The Lord's just not ready for me yet. There are other gifts of the Spirit, said Loyal. Prayer, preaching, prophecy, visions, laying hands on the sick, charity and works, even amongst your own family, he hesitated discreetly. There's good to be done there. Warily, Eugene looked up into the kind, candid eyes of his visitor. It ain't about what you want, said Loyal. It's about the perfect will of God. Harriet came in through the back door to find the kitchen floor wet and countertops wiped. But no Ida. The house was silent. No radio, no footsteps, only the monotone hum of the Frigidaire. Behind her, something scratched. Harriet jumped and turned just in time to see a small gray lizard scrabbling up the screen of the open window behind her. The smell of the pine cleaner that Ida used made her head ache in the heat. In the dining room, the massive china cabinet from Tribulation squatted amongst the hectic stacks of newspaper. Two oblong carving platters, leaning upright against the top shelf, gave it a wild-eye expression. Low and tense on its bowed legs, it slanted out from the wall on one side, ever so slightly, like a musty old saber? I don't know what that is. Saberer? Poised to leap out over the stacks of newspaper. Harriet ran an affectionate hand over it as she edged past, and the old cabinet seemed to pull its shoulders back and flatten itself obligingly against the wall to let her by. She found Ida Rue in the living room, sitting in her favorite chair where she ate her lunch, or sewed buttons, or shelled peas while she watched the soap operas. The chair itself, plump, comforting, with worn tweed upholstery and lumpy stuffing, had come to resemble Ida in the way that a dog sometimes resembles its owner, and Harriet, when she couldn't sleep at night, sometimes came downstairs and curled up in the chair with her cheek against the tweedy brown fabric, humming strange old sad songs to herself that nobody sang but Ida. Songs from Harriet's babyhood, songs as old and mysterious as time itself, about ghosts and broken hearts and loved ones dead and gone forever. Don't you miss your mother sometimes? Sometimes. Don't you miss your mothers sometimes? Sometimes. The flowers are blooming forevermore. There the sun will never go down. At the foot of the chair, Allison lay on her stomach with her ankles crossed. She and Ida were looking out the window opposite. The sun was low and orange, and the television aerials bristled on Mrs. Fountain's roof through a sizzle of afternoon glare. How she loved Ida. The force of it made her dizzy. With no thought whatever of her sister, Harriet skittered over and threw her arms passionately around Ida's neck. Ida started. "Gracious," she said, "where'd you come from?" Harriet closed her eyes and rested with her face in the moist warmth of Ida's neck, which smelled like cloves and tea and wood smoke, and something else, bittersweet and feathery, but quite definite, that was to Harriet the very aroma of love. Ida reached around and disengaged Harriet's arms. "You trying to strangle me?" she said. "Look there. We's just watching that bird over on the roof." Without turning around, Allison said, "He comes every day." Harriet shaded her eyes with her hand. On the top of Mrs. Fountain's chimney, pocketed neatly between a pair of bricks, stood a red-winged blackbird, spruce, soldierly in its bearing, with steady, sharp eyes and a fierce slash of scarlet, cutting like a military epaulette across each wing. "He's a funny one," said Ida. "Here's how he sound." She pursed her lips and expertly imitated the red-winged blackbird's call, not the liquid piping of the wood thrush, which dipped down into the dry of the cricket's burr, and up again in the delirious sobbing trills, not the clear three-note whistle of the chickadee, or even the blue jay's rough cry, which was like a rusty gate creaking. This was an abrupt, whirring, unfamiliar cry, a scream of warning, "Congaree!" which choked itself off on a subdued, fluting note. Allison laughed aloud. "Look," she said, rising up on her knees, for the bird had suddenly perked up, cocking its glossy, fine head intelligently to the side. "He hears you." "Do it again," said Harriet. Ida wouldn't do bird calls for them just any old time. You had to catch her in the right mood. "Yes, Ida, please." But Ida only laughed and shook her head. "You all remember, don't you," she said, "the old story how we got his red wing?" "No," said Harriet and Allison at once, though they did. Now that they were older, Ida told stories less and less, and that was too bad, because Ida's stories were wild and strange and often very frightening. Stories about drowned children and ghosts in the woods, and the buzzards' hunting party, about gold-toothed raccoons that bit babies in their cradles, and bewitched saucers of milk that turned to blood in the night. "Well, once upon a time in the long ago," said Ida, "there was an ugly little hunchback man so mad at everything, he decided to burn up the whole world. So he'd taken a torch in his hand, just as mad as he could be, and walked down to the big river where all the animals lived. Because back in the old days, there wasn't a whole lot of little second-class rivers and creeks like you have now. There was only the one. Over on Mrs. Fountain's chimney, the bird battered his wings, quick, businesslike, and flew away. Oh, look, there he goes. Ain't want to hear my story." With a heavy sigh, Ida glanced at the clock, and to Harriet's dismay, stretched and stood up. "And it's time for me to be getting home." "Tell us anyway. Tomorrow I'll tell you." "Ida, don't go," cried Harriet, as Ida Rue broke the small, contented silence that followed by heaving a sigh and moving towards the door slowly, as if her legs hurt her. Poor Ida. "Please?" "Oh, I'll be back tomorrow," said Ida wryly, without turning around, hoisting her brown paper grocery bag underneath her arm, trudging away heavily. "Never you worry." "Listen, Danny," said Farish, "Reese is leaving, so we're going to have to go on down to the square and listen to Eugene's." Abstractedly, he waved his hand in the air. "You know, that church bullshit." "Why," said Danny, pushing back his chair, Why we got to do that? The boy is leaving tomorrow, early tomorrow, knowing him. Well, come on. We'll just run down to the mission and put the stuff in his truck right now. We can't. He's went off somewhere. Damn. Danny sat and thought for a moment. Where you planning on hiding it? The engine? I know places that the FBI could tear that truck apart and never find it. How long is it going to take you? I said, how long is it going to take you? Danny repeated when he saw a hostile little spark up suddenly in Farish's eyes. To hide the stuff, Farish was slightly deaf in one ear from the gunshot, and when he was drugged up and paranoid, sometimes he misunderstood things in a really twisted way. Thought you told him to go fuck himself when really you'd asked him to shut the door or pass the salt. How long you say? Farish held up 5 fingers. So all right now, here's what we do. Why don't we skip the preaching and go on over there to the mission afterwards? I'll keep him busy upstairs while you go out and put the package in the truck, wherever, and that's all there is to it. Tell you what bothers me, said Farish abruptly. He sat down at the table beside Danny and began to clean his fingernails with a pocket knife. It was a car over there at Jean's just now. He called me about it. Car? What kind of car? Unmarked, parked out front. Farish heaved a bilious sigh. Took off when they saw Jean looking out the window at him. It's probably nothing. What? Farish reared back and blinked. Don't be whispering at me now. I can't stand it when you whisper. I said it's nothing. Danny looked at his brother intently, then shook his head. What would anybody want with Eugene? It's not Eugene they want, said Farish darkly. It's me. I'm telling you, there's government agencies got a file on me this thick. Farish, you didn't want to get Farish started on the federal government, not when he was cranked up like this. He'd ran all night and into the next day. Look here, he said. If you just go on and pay that tax. Farish shot a quick, angry glance at him. There was a letter coming just the other day. If you don't pay your taxes, Farish, they're going to come after you. This isn't about any tax, said Farish. The government's been surveilling my ass for 20 years. Harriet's mother pushed open the door to the kitchen where Harriet, head in hands, sat slumped at the table. Hoping to be asked what was wrong, she slumped down even further, but her mother did not notice her and went directly to the freezer, where she dug out the striped gallon bucket of peppermint ice cream. Harriet watched her as she reached up on tiptoe to get a wine glass from the top shelf and then laboriously scooped a few, scooped a few spoonfuls of ice cream into it. The nightgown she had on was very old, with filmy ice blue skirts and ribbons at the throat. When Harriet was small, she had been captivated by it because it looked like the blue fairy's gown in her book of Pinocchio. Now it just looked old, wilted, gone gray at the seams. Harriet's mother, turning to put the ice cream back in the freezer, saw Harriet slouching at the table. What's the matter? She said, as the freezer door barked shut. To start with, said Harriet loudly, I'm starving. Harriet's mother wrinkled her brow vaguely, pleasantly, and then, no, don't let her say it, thought Harriet, asked the very question that Harriet had known she would ask. Why don't you have some of this ice cream? I hate that kind of ice cream. How many times had she said it? Mother, I hate peppermint ice cream. She felt desperate all of a sudden. Didn't anybody ever listen to her? I can't stand it. I've never liked it. Nobody's ever liked it but you. She was gratified to see her mother's hurt expression. I'm sorry. I just thought we all enjoyed a little something light and cool to eat. Now that it's so hot at night, I don't. Well, get Ida to fix you something. Ida's gone. Didn't she leave you anything? No, nothing Harriet wanted anyway. Only tuna fish. Well, what would you like then? It's so hot you don't want anything heavy, she said doubtfully. Yes, I do. At Healy's house, no matter how hot it was, they sat down and ate a real supper every night. Big, hot, greasy suppers that left the kitchen sweltering. Roast beef, lasagna, fried shrimp. But her mother wasn't listening. Maybe some toast, she said, brightly as she replaced the ice cream carton in the freezer. Toast? Why, what's wrong with that? People don't have toast for dinner. Why can't we eat like regular people? At school in health class, when Harriet's teacher had asked the children to record their diets for 2 weeks, Harriet had been shocked to see how bad her own diet looked when it was written down on paper, particularly on the nights that Ida didn't cook. Popsicles, black olives, toast, and butter. So she'd torn up the real list and dutifully copied from a cookbook her mother had received as a wedding present, 1,000 Ways to Please Your Family. A prim series of balanced menus. chicken piccata, summer squash gratin, garden salad, apple compote. It's Ida's responsibility, said her mother with sudden sharpness, to fix you something. That's what I pay her for. If she's not fulfilling her duties, then we'll have to find somebody else. Shut up, screamed Harriet, overcome by the unfairness of this. Your father is after me all the time about Ida. He says she doesn't do enough around the house. I know you like Ida, but it's not her fault. If she's not doing what she should be, then Ida and I will have to have a little talk, said her mother, tomorrow. She drifted out with her glass of peppermint ice cream. Harriet, dazed and baffled by the turn their conversation had taken, put her forehead on the table. Presently, she heard someone come into the kitchen. Dully, she glanced up to see Allison standing in the doorway. You shouldn't have said that, she said. Leave me alone. Just then the telephone rang. Allison picked it up and said hello. Then her face went blank. She dropped the receiver so it swung by the cord. For you, she said to Harriet, walking out. The instant she said hello, Healy said in a rush, Harriet, listen to this. Can I eat dinner at your house? No, said Healy after a confused pause. Dinner at his house was over, but he'd been too excited to eat. Listen, Essie did go berserk. She busted some glasses in the kitchen and left. My dad drove by our house and Essie's boyfriend came out on the porch and they got into a huge fight and Dad told him to tell Essie not to come back. She was fired. Yay! But that's not why I called, he said rapidly, for Harriet had begun to stutter with horror at this. Listen, Harriet, there isn't much time. That preacher with the scar is down at the square right now. There's two of them. I saw it with Dad on the way home from Essie's, but I don't know how long they're going to be there. They've got a loudspeaker. I can hear them from my house. Harriet put the telephone down on the counter and went to the back door. Sure enough, from the vine-tangled seclusion of the porch, she heard the tinny echo of a loudspeaker, someone shouting indistinctly, the hiss and crackle of a bad microphone. When she went back to the telephone, Healy's breath, on the other hand, was ragged and secretive. Can you come out, she said. I'll meet you at the corner. It was after 7, still light outside. Harriet splashed some water on her face from the kitchen sink and went to the tool shed for her bicycle. As she flew down the driveway, the gravel popped under her tires until bump, her front wheel hit the street, and off she skimmed. Healy, astride his bicycle, was waiting at his corner. When he saw her in the distance, he took off, pedaling furiously. She soon caught up with him. The street lamps were not yet lit. The air smelled like hedge clippings and bug spray and honeysuckle. Rose beds blazed magenta and carmine and Tropicana orange in the fading light. They sped past drowsy houses, hissing sprinklers, a yipping terrier who shot out after them, chased behind them for a block or two with his little short legs flying, and then fell away. Sharply, they turned the corner of Walthall Street. The wide gables of Mr. Lilly's shingle Victorian flew towards them at a 45-degree angle, like a houseboat beached at a sideways tilt upon a green embankment. Harriet let the momentum whisk her through the turn. The fragrance of his climbing roses, clouds of sweetheart pink tumbling in great drifts from his trellised porch, blowing spicy and evanescent past her as she coasted, free for a second or two, and then pedaled furiously, rounding out upon Main. A hall of mirrors, white facades and columns in the rich light, receding in long, grand perspectives towards the square, where the flimsy white lattices and pickets of bandstand and gazebo bristled in the dim lavender distance against the deep blue scrim of the sky, all tranquility like a backlit stage set at the high school play, Our Town, except for the two men in white shirts and dark trousers, pacing back and forth, waving their arms, bowing, and rearing back to shout as they walked, their paths melting in the center and crisscrossing to and fro, to all four corners in an X formation. They were going at it like a pair of auctioneers, amplified in rhythmic cants that met and clashed and pulled apart in two distinct lines, Eugene Ratliff's mush-mouthed basso, or is it basso, and the high hysterical counterpoint of the younger man, an up-country twang, the sharp plucked eyes and ease of the mountains. Yo mama, yo daddy, your poor little baby that's in the ground. You mean to tell me that they're getting up? I mean to tell you that they're getting up. You mean to tell me that they'll rise again? I mean to tell you that they'll rise again. The book means to tell you that they'll rise again. Christ means to tell you that they'll rise again. The prophets mean to tell you that they'll rise again. As Eugene Ratliff stomped his foot and clapped so that a greasy hank of the gray ducktail shook loose and fell over his face, the wild-haired fellow flung his hands up and broke out in a dance. He shook all over, his white hands twitched as if the electrical current blazing from his eyes and standing by his hair on end had crackled throughout his entire body, jerking and jittering him all over the bandstand in forthright convulsions. I mean to shout it like the Bible times. I mean to shout it like Elijah done. Shout it loud to make the devil mad. Come on, children, make the devil mad. The square was practically deserted. Across the street stood a couple of teenage girls giggling uneasily. Mrs. Merrill Abbott stood in the door of the jewelry store over by the hardware store. A family sat in a parked car with the windows down, watching. On the little finger of the Ratliff preacher, held lifted out slightly from the pencil-thin microphone, as if from a teacup's handle, a ruby-colored stone caught the setting sun and flashed red, deep red. Here in these last days we're living in, we're here to preach the truth from the Bible. We're preaching this book like the olden days. We're preaching it like prophets done. Harriet saw the truck. The world is not my home, and saw with disappointment that the bed was empty. Sided amplifier that looked like a cheap briefcase. Oh, it's been a long time since some of you here now read your Bible, gone to church, got on your knees like a little child. All this preaching's getting me hoarse. Yee-haw! With the jolt, Harriet, that Eugene Ratliff was looking directly at her. For to be carnally minded is death. To be vengefully minded is death, for the lust of the flesh is death. Flesh, said Harriet rather mechanically. What? Healy said. It's flesh, not flush. For the wages of sin is death, for the lies of the devil are hell and death. Do we keep reading? How many more pages would I have to read to the next section? It's like 10 pages. There's no way I'm continuing. Not for this audience of 2. No, that's going to have to be it. I can go no further. I mean, I could go further, but we gonna stop. 269. No way. Ain't no way in hell, son. Ain't no way in hell. All right, Bobs, that's going to have to be it. Although it's only been 33 minutes. What the fuck we got in here? Hey, I'm watching you, buddy. It's just me and the secret people who now have to hide so I don't block them. How the hell is it only 33 minutes? If I went 17 more minutes, how many freaking pages would that be? That's a lot of pages, I think. I feel like it's a lot of pages. 10 more pages? How many pages did I read? I don't think I can do it. There's 8 pages. There's 10. 12 more pages? That's cray. Not doing it. All right, bros, I'm done. You don't deserve me. You know what deserves me?